What is up, y'all? Kevin Kuhn here from Athlete Factors. This is the Athlete Factors podcast. My guest today is Cassie Mitchell. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thank you. Really excited to have this chat with you. We've been able to talk a little bit before this recording, so I feel like I know you just a tad, which is always makes the conversation better. So please, if you will, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, athletically, academically, professionally, what you do now, and all of that.
Awesome. Okay. Athletically, I started gymnastics at an early age, transitioned into equestrian sports, and then continued that in college. Played intramural sports, didn't play any collegiate sports, but in my master's, I transitioned into competitive natural powerlifting, won my first meet, got a little bored. I'm a dabbler. So then moved to Virginia and discovered the joy of hiking and haven't stopped since. So I've hiked several hundred miles on the Appalachian Trail, gone on a lot of backpacking trips, and climbed, four 10,000 foot plus mountains. So
nice.
It's one of my favorite pastimes.
Very cool.
Academically, I've got my Bachelor's of Science in Health and Exercise Science from the University of Oklahoma in Norman. I then went on to do my Master's of Science in Nutritional Science at the University of Oklahoma Health Sciences Center in OKC. And from there, I moved to Virginia to do a PhD at Virginia Tech in Clinical Physiology and Metabolism from the Department of Human Nutrition, Foods, and Exercise, and also completed my coursework to become a registered dietitian. So at present, I'm a PhD RD and in a postdoc.
Wow, that's
the mouthful.
Phenomenal. Yeah. Well, it's at the very least extremely impressive. So, for sure. So tell us a little bit about what you're currently doing.
Okay, so currently I'm a postdoc at the NIH's NIDDK. They have two branches for NIDDK, one in Bethesda, one in Phoenix. Our primary mission is to look at digestive, diabetes, and kidney diseases. The research section I'm in Phoenix is the obesity and diabetes clinical research section. So we have a lot of ongoing studies across our branch. We have a blend of genetics, epidemiology, and clinical research. I'm primarily involved in clinical research studying obesity and energy balance, and the depth of those projects includes metabolomics, the microbiome, controlled diets to look at effects of diets to develop dietary biomarkers, and collaborating on a couple of psych assessments and stuff like that as well for eating behaviors.
Wow. So, one of the things so first and foremost, our mutual friend Mandy got us connected because
she did.
Yes, which I'm very grateful for. And it was because I wanted to find a guest who could let's say make the connection or have the perspective of both a dietitian as well as a sports nutritionist. And she was like, oh, I got the perfect person for you. So in addition to, the PhD and being an RD, you're also a sports nutritionist. So can you tell us a little bit about what are the differences between those two things and kind of, break that down for us.
Okay. So just a couple points to clarify. So I actually used the sports nutritionist certification through the CISSN or the ISSN, but certified sports nutritionist, to get my foot in the door doing nutrition consulting, teaching classes about nutrition to a wide range of individuals from, 16 to 60. And just talking about recovery for exercise. So I did those courses and consults at gyms. And that really helped me leverage my foot in the door to become a dietitian. But the interesting thing is once you're a dietitian, having a certification for sports nutrition, usually they prefer, the organization prefers it to be the CSSD, which is a certified sports dietitian. So those are a little bit different, the CISSN versus the CSSD. So would it be okay if I kind of talked about those differences?
For sure. Yes, that'd be great.
Okay, awesome. So the certification for sports nutrition through the ISSN requires taking a course in sports nutrition, having a degree related to exercise physiology or sports nutrition, and then taking the exam, which is a very comprehensive exam on metabolism and the metabolism and physiology aspects of sport and then of nutrition, and linking that all together. So a lot of it focuses on performance, recovery, coming back from an injury. There's different recommendations for things like protein, supplementation. One of the biggest things I got from that course was how to find and identify evidence-based supplements for athletes. I'm sure you know that's a huge problem, finding reputable supplements, since they're not regulated by the FDA unless there's an adverse event. So that was actually an incredible and unexpected outcome of doing that certification that I think actually prepped me really well to be a dietitian and to pursue sports nutrition. So the CSSD, which is the Certified Specialist in Sports Dietetics, has a lot of additional requirements besides a related degree and the course eligibility. So you first have to be a certified RD. You have to maintain your RD status for a minimum of 2 years before the examination. You have to have over 2,000 verifiable hours of sports dietetics practice as an RD within a 5-year segment. And then you have to have completed a graduate degree in sports nutrition, exercise physiology, or exercise science. So if you have a doctorate, 400 of those hours for a doctorate can count towards your certification, but a master's is the minimum now. And that's a newer requirement. Professional experiences that count, you have a little bit more flexibility. So if you are the primary author of an article in a peer-reviewed publication, they'll allot you a certain amount of those 2,000 hours to go towards that. So there's a little bit more flex since the hour requirement is so huge. 2,000 hours is a lot. And thinking about being employed as a dietitian in sport, but not having that certification can be a little difficult. Most jobs already want you to have that. So I think that's also where there's that extra flexibility built in. But those are the main differences between the two certifications.
Gotcha. So when it comes to like I've had a few dietitians on the podcast. I've had Dr. Willoughby on the podcast who helped, he wrote one of the chapters in the ISSN textbook. He's one of the founding members. I've had Jose Antonio on, who's the CEO. I've had quite a few other people who are who serve on the administration now or who have been on it before. So I'm trying to, as much as possible, combine these two areas of nutrition, right? Because so much of what I do as a professional is, like I'm working maybe about 50 to 75% of my clientele are what I consider like legitimate athletes, either youth athletes or adult athletes training for Ironman, training for other triathlon distances, marathon, stuff like that.
Sure.
And then I have probably about a quarter of my clients who are just, your average Joes and Janes who they just know they need to exercise to be healthy. And so, there's a lot of the quote unquote sports nutrition that's maybe not as applicable to them, but I still need to have, a grasp of general general nutrition. So,
Oh, absolutely.
So what are the big pillars, I guess, that you see in the differences between like clinical nutrition or the dietetic side versus sport nutrition, as far as like what are the things that each of these camps, let's say, are
Okay.
focusing on?
I think one of the biggest differences in more clinical nutrition or dietitians is the assessment. So when I say assessment, I mean we have like we kind of call ABC. So we have anthropometrics, we have I totally just blinked in the middle of that sentence. But basically, that happens. I could see it.
It happens.
The anthropometrics, we have the biochemical part, so looking at labs and chemistries, and then we look at the history, health history. So we kind of get a really thorough background and then current conditions or chronic diseases. So we look at all of that, we assess that, and then we, follow up on those chronic conditions to make sure, like, are they being treated? When were they diagnosed? How might they influence someone's exercise capacity? Because as I'm sure any exercise physiologist knows, things like beta blockers are obviously really important to identify when you're doing exercise prescription. But on top of that, other things like blood pressure, if someone's on 2 medications for it and it's still high, like how do we address that with diet so that someone can safely exercise, if that makes sense. So I think that's one of the big approaches. And then we move into the diet, and then we move into the exercise. How are you eating? What are you doing? What do you consider vigorous? Because it's important to get someone's perception of that before we just start talking about it. Because that can really vary, especially based on things like age and body weight. For the sports nutrition side, I would say one of the big differences is for sports nutrition, we kind of go right to diet and exercise, but maybe not as thorough of a background to really understand the person's history. And I think some of that has to do with the inherent liability when you're not, licensed for liability as a clinical provider. So it makes complete sense and why the approach and the assessment might be different. But I would say those of the 2 camps, I think that's one of the bigger defining differences.
Yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense to me. Like if you're qualified to do that level of kind of investigation, like why wouldn't you? Like you could learn a lot about, what's going to potentially help and what may not help just by knowing those sorts of things.
Right. And access to labs. I think that's a huge one when you're in like a medical system and someone wants to change their lifestyle or begin exercising or change their exercise. We can kind of see what's going on with like liver enzymes or blood pressure or blood glucose and see, are they having any lows? Has there been a big change in A1C? Because that's really important for older individuals and also for young individuals that are really healthy. Sometimes they can experience, I'm sure the bottoming out because of the low blood glucose. So knowing the labs behind it can be really helpful. Sometimes it's no help at all, not because maybe they haven't gone to the doctor regularly, so there's no benefit. But other times, if they're very methodical and have a long history, it can be fantastic.
Nice. So this is where things can get a little, let's say, controversial. So I'll try not to make it like this side's better because this side sucks and so on and so forth. I'm not trying to do that.
You will not offend me. Promise.
Good. Awesome. Well, I don't want to offend. I want to offend everybody equally. I don't want to not offend someone. I just want to offend everyone equally.
Fair.
So it's tough. I see this in the industry quite a bit because there's plenty of people with like their own private practice, let's say, their own business, okay, where like I I feel like I'm extremely qualified to give the nutrition coaching that I do. And
Absolutely.
I'm not trying to help somebody. I'm not trying to cure somebody of a disease, right? I'm trying to, like, this is what I consider preventive medicine or preventive health care, let's say.
Absolutely.
Like, I think I'm very well within my lane. Okay. But there's a ton of overlap between what I do and what a dietitian does. And now, like, there's a whole lot of chiropractors who are given nutrition coaching or nutrition advice or pushing specific diets, let's say. And so there's all this overlap. So if you're just a regular person, or if you're an athlete, what do you do? Who do you go to? Okay.
That is a $1 million question. So my biggest piece of advice, or my opinion, and this has definitely not ever changed, is teams are always better. Teams, whether it's for sport training or athletic performance, a team of qualified individuals is always going to provide a more comprehensive solution, regardless of the scenario. It's impossible for one person to know everything and think of everything all the time for every person. I mean, I don't know anybody that can do that. So I think that's, the benefit of working together. I think, we have this problem a lot in a hospital setting too, where non-qualified providers are giving out outdated nutrition information. So I would say the scenario you're describing is also rampant in hospitals. Fortunately, not the one that I work for, but I could tell you some stories. Yes. So I think this is a common thing because food is a universal experience. If you are alive, you have to eat. So it's personal for a lot of people. And in my opinion, Google is the worst thing to ever happen to nutrition because there's so much information out there. But I think the difficult aspect of this is when you're living in a country where like 2/3 of the population have at least one chronic disease, it becomes really hard to provide general advice because that general advice, that's exactly what it is. It's general. So if you have someone with one or more chronic diseases, something as simple as like, eat fruits rich in antioxidants, that could be problematic for somebody that is taking medications for blood thinners. So it's one of those things where it gets hard. And I would say even in nutrition as a field, like there's some people that are not qualified to give that type of advice, and there's some people that are. So I think one of the biggest things is scope of practice or staying in your lane, like you mentioned. I do think it's great to form partnerships. Like if you found somebody that you've really trusted for sports nutrition, working in tandem with them or referring out if you think, okay, I can give you some basic things that I know are going to be good for you. But your questions are maybe more in depth than what I feel comfortable, even if you know the answer, comfortable addressing. Here's what I think this provider or consultant might say, but ask them.
Gotcha. So do you think there's like categories or kind of generalized goals, let's say, that would be best addressed by a dietitian versus a sport nutritionist? Like, let's say you've got somebody who, like, all they care about is changing their body comp and they want to go from, like they just want to lose a couple pant sizes. They're not trying to get stage ready for a physique competition, right? Like they just want to lose a little bit of weight. Like who's going to probably do a better job there?
Well, definitely not Instagram, which I feel like is where everybody gets their information for that.
That's a good answer.
And unfortunately, a lot of times it's like a front row seat to someone developing an eating disorder. Uh, but I think ultimately finding someone with experience, finding someone with certifications. I mean, as a dietitian, professionally, I need to say a dietitian, but a general practice dietitian isn't going to know that type of stuff. And I think if someone's going to a gym looking for that and finds a personal trainer or a strength and conditioning specialist that also has that certification, I think it's appropriate to start there.
Gotcha. So it's not just, let's say, the letters behind the name, but also some
Practical experience.
perfect, yeah, some
Yes.
evidence to show that they've been able to do this in a
Yeah,
healthy way with a
exactly.
lot of people, and they would recommend this person, and they don't hate them after.
Right. And truly, dietetics education doesn't cover sports very much, if at all. It really depends on the program and the university and whether or not they offer sports dietetics electives or experiential learning. So some dietitians have no idea about the actual exercise physiology because they've only ever taken nutrition courses. And in that case, it would also be appropriate for a dietitian to confer with an exercise specialist because that's not in their scope of practice. So
Gotcha.
I think
So
it swings both ways.
for sure. Um, Forgive me if this is an ignorant question.
No.
How much education does a dietitian receive when it comes to thermodynamics of of body composition changes? Like how much emphasis, like the majority of what we learned, at least initially
Mm-hmm.
in prepping for the CISSN, is like, hey, here's the laws of thermodynamics. Here's the law of conservation of mass. Here's exactly how you calculate someone's need, their caloric need. Here's how you you can't make changes in weight without being in a calorie deficit. Here's how you calculate a calorie deficit. Here's how you like. So it's all of that, and it's all very, very well established. And it
Mm-hmm.
cracks me up because I hear all the time, mostly from people on Facebook and Instagram, that calories aren't a thing; they're an outdated thing. And I'm like, okay, so what's the new thing? No idea, crickets. But calories, whatever. So how much? Like that's what I use. Like these are the
Right.
equations. I calculate someone's calorie need. If somebody comes to me and they want to lose weight or they want to change their body comp, this is how I set it up. What's the process for a dietitian to help someone lose weight?
Okay, so first question I think you asked is how much about thermodynamics and changing body composition do dietitians learn
Mm-hmm.
beyond a potentially required physics course? There's maybe one or two classes on that. And I can say for sure there's usually at least one because I taught that class in my PhD. And so what
Nice.
we did was had 13 weeks, and the first like 6 or 7 were about nutrition assessment. So we did stuff like how to assess hydration status, where it was a lab, so students would collect their own urine samples, use the stick, compare it to the container with the pH strips, and
Mm-hmm.
see. We had them do blood draws so they could actually measure their own cholesterol, their own blood glucose, just to see what that lab process is like, as well
Mm-hmm.
as using tons of types of nutrition assessment methods. The second half of the course was also lab based, but it was exercise prescription. So a lot of what they learned is ways to measure body composition, pros and cons to each. Like they all actually got a DEXA, which
Mm-hmm.
is a huge group effort because there were about 140 students. So
Wow.
yes, so we had a couple of TAs and we did the DEXAs. We
Yeah.
sent them across to the campus rec for a bod pod. We talked about skin calipers, skin folds, just different things like that, had them measure it on each other so they could see a couple things like discomfort. If If you're larger, skin folds are personal, they're uncomfortable, and I would argue a lot of people probably don't want to have that done, which is where something like BIA, although it's
less accurate maybe.
Yes, highly dependent on hydration. That might be in a client's comfort zone more so. We also used the metabolic cart to measure RMR. We also measured VO2 max, and we did several different submax tests in there. So I think that class had a really nice blend, and the labs had them think critically, read articles, and kind of comprehensively discuss things like body composition changes, differences in the methods. But I think our program was unique because it also, the department had exercise, so students could kind of blend their education. But if it's just a dietetics class, dietetics program, there's maybe just one course. So
Gotcha.
It's slim, which is why there's that certification and why the hour requirements are so huge.
So
also, one last thing, that's why there's
a
master's required now.
Gotcha.
So I believe I think it's 2024, minimum requirement to do dietetics or to get an internship is a master's. So because nutrition is so rapidly expanding, and a bachelor's isn't enough to debunk all the junk that's out there, like calories not being real, which blows my mind.
I hear it fairly often, like, or it's this whole
concerning.
A calorie isn't a calorie, depending on, what type of macro is it? If it's sugar, then if you drink a can of soda, that's not the same as eating, 2 apples, but like the calorie content's the same. It's like.
So that digestive physiology is definitely something to consider.
For sure.
I think that's definitely a limitation of the, if it fits your macros approach is, you can make an entirely processed diet fit your macros, and it's not necessarily a good thing.
For sure. Yeah. But even in that, I think about this one a lot.
You can still lose weight though from the, which
so that's,
I get is the argument.
Exactly. So that's the thing. If you're looking at things just from the thermodynamic perspective, then calorie is people get really emotional about it. It's a measurement tool, right? That's like saying, okay, well, I ran a mile, but it's a mile uphill is obviously not the same as a mile downhill. So is the mile downhill worth less than the mile uphill? They're both a mile. Well, obviously there's a huge difference there. But if you're not, you're adding these other things in that okay, now we're changing the discussion here, and you're trying to sneak these other stupid things in. Let's just talk about this. Right. Obviously, the quality of your food is important. And the original, I guess, promoters of the if it fits your macros movement were none of that. It all came down to Pop-Tarts. This was the origin. The origin of this was, okay, well, because it's a bunch of bros on a bodybuilding forum discussing, they're all eating super, super controlled broccoli, chicken breast,
and rice.
Exactly. And it's all very controlled, all very quote unquote clean. And
I hate that.
The question, I know it's stupid. And
it's not objective.
Yeah. And somebody says, okay, well, can I at least, have a Pop-Tart? And the response was, well, yeah, of course, but you still have to hit your macros. So you still have to hit your protein goal. First, you have to hit your calorie goal. You have to hit your protein goal. You have to hit your fat goal. But if you can fit in, a Pop-Tart and still hit your carb goal, then yeah, definitely. But if it takes you over, obviously not. So you're going to have to adjust something somewhere. But somehow that went from it's like the quote unquote 90-10 rule or the 80-20 rule to all of a sudden, I can eat whatever I want as long as I hit my macros, which means first, like most people hear the if it fits your macros and they immediately throw out the macros and they're like, okay, well, I'll just eat whatever I want and hit my calorie goal. It's extremely difficult to hit. Like if you set up your macros the way that I learned how to do it, where like you calculate your calorie needs, and then my second priority after that is what's your protein goal, and I try to get my athletes to work up to at least 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight per day. If they can tolerate, or not even tolerate, if they enjoy eating more than that, then I promote that as much as possible. And then after that, we calculate their fat needs or their fat goals, and that's, usually no less than 20% of their total calories. But again, that depends. Are you at maintenance or are you in a calorie deficit? Because that's going to change things. The more we go into
a hormone regulator, and I think a
exactly
huge mistake so many people make is they go way too low fat, and then it disrupts the weight loss.
Exactly.
Yeah. I like that that's the second thing you assess and not the last.
Yeah, like carbs I usually put last, and they're like the first that I make any sort of drops on if a client is going into, if we're programming a calorie deficit. Like I try to maintain protein and fat as long as possible until they get to the point where they're either like, okay, I need some carbs here. Like I can feel my mood change, or I just feel sluggish, and at that point I'm like, okay, we can maybe cut into protein and fat a little bit here. Let's bump the carb numbers up. And
constipated.
That too. That's not a good thing either.
That's a real thing. with the high protein.
Yeah, we'll save the poop talk for when we get into the gut microbiome. Thanks, Mandy.
Talk about this.
Yes. So that's going to be fun. But yeah, so I think I was getting off kind of on this whole tangent rabbit trail, but all of that to say, like, I don't hear many dietitians like programming or setting things up in a way that's similar to that. And so like, how do you, if you're working with a client who's trying to lose weight, or let's say you're not working with someone who wants to lose weight, you're working with somebody who wants to just maximize their sport performance, how as a dietitian do you know you're doing the right thing?
Well, that's where I think the baseline assessment is so important, and figuring out a way. I would recommend not just the 24-hour recall, which is a really common practice in dietetics, but maybe a food frequency questionnaire, or if the athlete already has like a MyFitnessPal log, just printing out, the first Monday of every week for 2 months, so we can kind of see, or a Monday, a Saturday, a Wednesday, and just picking like one random non-overlapping day per week, so we can get an idea of the full picture. Mm-hmm. Because I'm sure that weekend patterns differ from weekday patterns. It's important to see the difference and consider what day you're assessing. Mm-hmm. I think other than that, figuring out first off are they male or female? Because looking at amenorrhea, other life goals besides just competing, like if it's a woman, do you want to have a child in the next couple years? Because if so, like we need to talk about how that meets your performance goals, because that's something to consider that not every woman knows to start thinking about as an athlete. I think the other things to talk about with men, especially with performance, is like what might happen with testosterone when we start manipulating these macronutrients to hit a body composition goal, because there's a slew of side effects that come with manipulating diet to the point that testosterone is affected, which can be common in bodybuilding. So I think doing an assessment like that, where we talk about how long have you been competing in this sport, what are your goals, when's your next competition, how did you perform at your last couple competitions, how are you eating, what's your typical workout, are you working with anyone, and if a trainer, and is that trainer comfortable talking with me about how we can collectively meet your goals is kind of the starting point. And then when we talk about, how do we know if we're doing the right thing, getting metrics of performance, I think, and assessing how they feel when they're meeting the new dietary intake goals that we set. Because I think, if they're hitting those goals and they're feeling like crap, but their performance hasn't changed, that's still important. We still need to adjust it to where they feel optimized. And I think, again, that is where it comes down to making sure we're doing the right thing. A lot of times involves a team effort, because if you have an athlete whose performance you're trying to optimize, and then they come to me, but we don't talk, we could be giving really conflicting information.
Mm-hmm.
So I think those are just it's kind of like the big picture of what I would consider.
Gotcha. So here's one of the things that, from my perspective, I struggle with, and that's like coming from the background that I have, where I was a competitive distance runner. There were plenty of girls on our team who they looked hungry all the time. I don't know a better way to say it. Like they looked malnourished, I guess. Right. I don't even. So, like, endurance sports, like by definition or like by nature, like you are tapping into stored fuel.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's plenty of times where you can't eat enough during the event to maintain, glycogen stores, right, things like that. So, right. So like my goal as a sport nutrition coach is to know with as much reasonably well how right. much calories are being expended, and like what's a general range of calories that they need. Like there's a huge range where you can put an endurance athlete in a big calorie deficit and they're still going to perform well, and mm-hmm. they're going to feel fine because they're used to feeling like crap all the time. Like right. Endurance runners are always sore, they're always tired. And if you don't know, tell me what you think about this. If you don't know what your calorie needs are and you're an endurance athlete, you're probably not eating enough calories. And so if you're just going based off of, well, I feel decently recovered, I feel like I'm probably eating enough, I'm obviously competing decently well. Like, yeah, things hurt here and there, but that's normal. Like, that's what I see a lot of, and that really irks me. So, sure. So I think it's like, if you don't know your calorie needs, you're obviously not doing what I personally think you should. So
I think my approach to that would be probably, if someone came to me and said that, I would be like, all right, well, like, let's make a deal. How about you download MyFitnessPal and just eat how you normally would, scan your stuff in, and bring it back to me so that I can see, if you think you're eating enough. Sometimes people really are. Mm-hmm. Not often in the athletic realm. Mm-hmm. I agree with you there. But I think getting a baseline just to know what their perception of enough is really important, because weight is stigmatized in a lot of sports. So not just mm-hmm. endurance, which I know you and I have talked about before, how that perception of you need to be light because weighing more is going to slow you down. You're not going to perform as well, which is mm-hmm. BS. But even in other power sports, like for example, gymnastics, you're putting so much stress and strain on your joints mm-hmm. and doing, 3-hour workouts most days. It's so important to make sure you're recovering well, even though you're not expending glycogen in the same way or at the same capacity that an endurance runner might be. Mm-hmm. I think the biggest thing is like, let's get a grasp on their baseline, see how they're performing and adjust it, and ask first. Like, one of the things I'm really big on is getting permission. So if someone came to me and, they need 2,500 calories, but they're regularly only eating 1,900, saying they feel fine, I might say, hey, are you open to talking about your calorie needs? And, if they agree, I would say, to optimize your performance, you really need to be eating up here. I know that's a lot of food to start taking in. So how about we start working up to that in 200 calorie blocks and see how you feel. See if you're performing better. See, if you start adding foods and not feeling so good, like, let's talk about what foods we could tweak to make sure you're hitting that calorie goal. And once they're comfortably eating there, I would focus on macros, but I probably wouldn't overload someone that's eating, 600 or 700 calories less than they need to be.
Yeah. Yeah, that's probably too much of a jump to just drop on somebody.
Yeah, and then saying like, oh, also I need you to eat this much protein, but don't forget the fat, and like, let's eat some carbohydrates. It's a lot. Yeah. So I think that'd kind of be my approach, because it is important to know calorie needs for an athlete.
Thank you for saying that.
I think the other really important thing, though, is actively addressing and debunking weight stigma when we talk about performance and we talk about nutrition. And I don't think a lot of people are aware of that. Because, we've talked about it with endurance runners, but in certain sports like gymnastics, that sport has a really high aesthetic, but it's a power sport. And it requires a ton of precision. And the aesthetic piece of that, there's so much pressure to look a certain way when you execute a move or a tumbling pattern. And if you don't, but even though you did it well, you might not get scored as well as someone who looked prettier doing it. It's wrong, but it happens. So talking about that and making sure we loop what we're doing back to keeping a pulse on body appreciation and destigmatizing body weight.
Gotcha. No, I think you're right. I think that's extremely important. That's a tough one in the world of running specifically. There's a lot of runners and triathletes who will specifically eat less because they want to look like an endurance athlete.
Yep.
And that can cause just all kinds of issues. Just that are really hard to come back from. I mean, like, if you're in a chronic deficit and you're just training yourself into the ground, like, for women, like, obviously there's a whole bunch of problems that are unique to their physiology and their anatomy and biochemistry and things like that. But I mean, I know a lot more guys who have had that issue just because men have been more comfortable. Like, we can talk about that, like, in the locker room we're discussing that. But yeah, I was following. I had this guy on my podcast a while back, Mark Bottenhorn, and his post today, he was talking about that because 2 years ago he started powerlifting, and he's like a hybrid athlete. He's an ultra runner, but he also does like these obstacle course races and stuff like that. But he's put on a ton of muscle in the past 2 years, and I think he looks amazing. And there's plenty of people who will comment on his posts like, you looked better 2 years ago, because he was skinnier. And like, what's crazy is to get to that point, he was to get to the point where he looked like a runner, he was not healthy. He was like, I've got to cut my calories. I've got to look like a runner. And he just was struggling big time with that. And now he's running way better. He's way stronger. It's crazy how, like, it is stigmatized, like, big time. And we all need to work to fix that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And on the powerlifting point, I will say that was the hardest aspect of training for a meet, is how weight-centric that sport is. Not just the lifting weights, but like being in a weight class, making sure you hit your weight class, figuring out which weight class you're going to be most competitive in for what you can lift. And after doing it, I can see why more women don't, because that was so mentally tough on me. And I just came out of that thinking, I certainly don't know the most about this, but I know a lot about it. And if it was hard for me, like, how difficult would this be for someone who knows nothing?
Yeah.
Mentally, just watching your body change and knowing you're lifting more, but looking at yourself and thinking, I'm uncomfortable. None of my clothes fit. Like, I'm bigger. I look different in photos. I feel different in my body. It's hard. Yeah. Even though it's like, I'm strong, I can lift stuff by myself. I don't need help, and it's awesome and it's empowering. But internally, there's this whole other side to it that a lot of people don't talk about, and I thought it was really tough.
For sure, I can only imagine that. Like, I've never, for a while after grad school, it was really important for me to gain weight because I wanted to be a strength coach who worked with endurance athletes. I didn't want to be a guy who looked like an endurance athlete who was trying to be a strength coach. So
again, with the perceptions, right?
Yes, for sure. And now I'm to the point where I'm like, I don't look as much like an endurance athlete as I used to. And I'm trying to run a lot more now. So
it's crazy. No one's immune to it. Whether you're working in that area or competing in it, it's hard. And it's something that needs to be brought to the table more.
For sure. Yeah, I remember like in nutritional biochemistry class in grad school with Dr. Darren Wilby, like he was telling us how, like, I mean, he's at the time, I think he was 46 and maybe 230 to 260, somewhere in there, but 4 to 6% body fat. He was jacked, and he was like, I look in the mirror and I still see a skinny kid. Like
wow.
Yeah.
I am familiar with what he looks like from the ISSN stuff, and skinny is not a word I would use.
Yeah. No, not at all.
Yes. He walks the walk for sure.
Exactly. So it's refreshing to hear people, be open to talking about it, and like,
right.
I think that's really important. Just being willing to discuss things like that. So, so here's another thing that I hear a lot from dietitians. This whole thing sounds like I'm just like, dietitians this, dietitians that.
Other dietitians are gonna hate me after this.
I think they're gonna hate me too, like they didn't already.
Hopefully not. I hope I'm bringing a balanced, evidence-based approach to this, but
well, if I don't get any more dietitians on the podcast, I'm gonna know who to blame.
You?
Myself, yeah. So I hear this one a lot. Just eat the rainbow, right?
Yeah.
So tell me about eating the rainbow. Like, I think I know what that means. I'm pretty sure I know what that means. I've heard it enough to like.
I don't know why we say that, because it sounds like a Skittles commercial. That's all I think of when I hear that. But I am guilty of using similar stuff with patient education, putting plates together and being like, what do you think is wrong with this? Not wrong, but like, what do you think is off about the way this plate is assembled? And it'll be, mashed potatoes, corn, and fried chicken. And it's like, obviously, it's all brown and there's no vegetables, because mashed potatoes and corn are not, the non-starchy, right? The non-starchy, high nutrient vegetables that we want people to eat more of. So being in Arizona, I said, make your plate look like a jungle, not like the desert. And then in my head, I was like, oh my gosh, this is just as bad as Eat the Rainbow, but it really clicked for people. Which was also what blew my mind. So I was like, maybe there's something to the fact that this sounds like a Skittles commercial. I don't know. Um, yeah. Anyway, value of telling athletes to eat the rainbow. I think this just comes back to, well, it's not a very effective message. That's the first thing. The second thing is making sure that we emphasize high nutrient, high antioxidant foods to maximize recovery. And where people are going to get that are things like those non-starchy vegetables and berries. I mean, certainly other fruits and vegetables are fantastic, but, you know, leafy greens, tomatoes, onions, garlic, all of those things promote a lot of heart health, cardiovascular health. They deliver other phytochemicals that we're not going to get from a processed food, because I've heard people make the argument like, oh, I can get that from a multivitamin. And it's like, well, you can, but there's also other properties to this food that aren't in that multivitamin that are going to enhance your performance and how you feel. So I think, you know, that's the detail behind the message that doesn't come through. So I think it's important to emphasize the vegetable aspect or the rainbow aspect, but doing it in a way that perhaps gives a little bit more credit to the person we're talking to. Because especially when we're talking about, you know, calories don't matter, they're not a thing anymore. If it fits your macros, I can have like 10 Pop-Tarts today. I mean, I think, you know, this is trying to reframe the mixed messages that we get from some of these approaches to diet, which are arguably there. So I think reframing it is maybe the goal, and not something I would actually tell an athlete. But it warrants a discussion, like talking about the importance of different high nutrient produce.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of those things like I hear it quite a bit now that people talk about, you know, like, should you avoid fruit because of fructose? You know, like, that's a sugar.
Really?
Sugar's bad. Like, this is a thing now. So, but like, who's getting unhealthy eating a ton of fruit? Like, it just doesn't happen. Like, nobody's gaining weight chowing down on apples. Like, that doesn't happen. So, but yeah, it's another one of the phobias, you know, like, everything has to be fat free, and then we shifted from that to now everything has to be low carb, and then, you know, exactly. So it's going to transition to something else, I'm sure, at some point. Like,
oh yeah,
like there's an anti-high protein group out there that, and it's like, okay, so at some point this will shift into like all protein is bad. Like, nobody should be eating protein. So it'll just fluctuate. Thank goodness we only have 3 macros, right? If there
have you heard that ketones are the 4th?
How can they be? How?
Because you can take them in a powder and a drink. I'm not kidding you. This is a thing.
But it's from fat, though. Like it's just
they are.
It's from fat metabolism. You just break, like, that's like is sugar its own macro? Because, like,
I know, but I was just like, I'm
the
not
4th
even going to
macro.
respond to this because I don't know where to start and how to do it nicely.
First of all, that's dumb. That's what I would say.
First of all, you're wrong.
Yeah.
Second, that's dumb.
Yeah. I would switch those. Oh my goodness, that's ridiculous.
But on the eat the rainbow question, I also, when we're talking about those non-starchy vegetables and leafy greens, there is actually an interesting study that recently came out talking about how foods like spinach may actually help improve lower limb strength and potentially athletic performance because it's naturally rich in nitrate. So eating those types of foods, or the rainbow, I guess, do have more nitrates in there, which can help endothelial function. It can help strength. And that study came from, I wrote it down so I wouldn't mess this up. It was a 12-year study, and it came from the Melbourne Baker Heart Study. So that's something that, if someone's interested, they can look that up. But I thought that was actually pretty interesting because you don't often see more epidemiological type studies focusing on strength or performance and talking about vegetables. So I was like, all right, maybe Popeye was onto something.
Exactly. Yeah, that whole connection. Like, I watched Popeye a ton when I was a kid.
Right.
But it was like, yeah, like, okay, well, if you want to grow up big and strong, you got to eat your veggies and you got to eat your spinach, right? And then I get to like college and I like start to learn a little bit about protein metabolism. And then I get to grad school and I'm like, huh? Like, how did these veggies relate to mTOR at all?
Right.
Like, how do they fit in with anabolism in any way? Like, but here we go. It's dietary nitrates.
Interesting. So, I mean, it'll be cool ultimately, studies like this, we need to have some replication, potentially a clinical trial, because I don't think, I haven't read the full study, but I don't think that they're giving trackable amounts of spinach to 3,000 people, because there was like 31 or 3,200. So I suspect this is a correlation, not a causative thing. So, there's pros and cons to this because in nutrition research, there's a very big criticism about kind of doing a reductionist approach where we target one food and we don't target a dietary pattern. So I think this outcome might be a little difficult to address in clinical research and replicate, but looking at high nitrate foods and maybe a controlled feeding design and looking at athletic performance and lower limb strength could be really interesting.
Gotcha. Because like that's the whole theory or rationale behind like beetroot, right? Is the high nitrate content.
Right.
And how that somehow translates to increased nitric oxide production or some other potential things. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not overly well versed in this. I'm familiar with it from a performance standpoint, but I'm not an expert in this aspect for sure. But that's my understanding.
Yeah, I think it's a conspiracy from all the beet farmers because they're like, we've got to unload these, and they are disgusting.
Beets are so good, especially you have to try a golden beet.
Okay, I've never had a golden beet, but I'm just saying if they tasted so good, then why are they so disgusting?
Well, in the UK, beets are their corn. So,
really?
Yeah, so beets are actually they use I don't know how they process it, but our high fructose corn syrup that we get from corn, they have a beet
sugar
beets in the UK. Yes.
Gotcha.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting.
That is interesting. Okay, well. All right, I'll try a golden beet at some point.
On a salad, you need like some arugula and some goat cheese.
Oh, so you need stuff to cover up the flavor of the beets. I completely understand that. Yeah.
I promise they're good.
I don't even mind beets that much, but I know a ton of people who are like, beets are gross, and who have had like the beet supplement stuff, and they're like, it's awful. I just got to choke it down. And then there's other people who are like, oh no, I like the way it tastes. And then you watch them drink it, and they're like, oh. It's so good.
I know. That's really well. Try the golden beets in a salad, not covered up, no dressing.
Just dump a whole container of ranch on top.
I mean, you could start it that way, but you're going to be missing out. Golden beets are so good.
All right, I'm not going to take your word for it. I'm going to try it.
Okay.
So we talked a little earlier about weight category athletes and endurance athletes. So specifically when it comes to these types of athletes and especially female athletes of these types of sports, what are some of the potential trade-offs or maybe negatives that could arise if there's too much emphasis on tracking calories or macros?
There's obviously, we've covered a lot of the pros, so I'm just going to kind of highlight the cons for this part of it, so I'm not repeating myself. But, I think our culture in general is weight-centric. We prefer a certain aesthetic in the way people look. It even impacts clinical care. So one of the biggest things that is a con with this is putting even more emphasis on that on someone who's already got low body fat, who's already going to be thin, especially in an endurance athlete. They're already muscular. They're already competing at such a high level that adding extra emphasis to this could, prime somebody for disordered eating or a downright eating disorder. So I think, that's something where with the messaging that we give athletes, when we're talking about food, we're talking about body comp, we're talking about performance, we need to be really mindful of that and keeping kind of neutral language. And I think bringing a level of transparency to this about talking about pros and cons, like if we measure everything in this, here's a risk, here's something I'm concerned about for all athletes, but if we don't, here's the other drawback. So, what are you comfortable with? Like, have you thought this through? Has anyone brought this up to you before? Just really having that transparent dialogue, because I think the biggest con of course is, like I said, disordered eating, but also not having a plan in place to transition an athlete back to not competing. A lot of times we focus so hard on performance, so hard on tracking calories and macros and times, like we have all these metrics. And then, at some point, most people stop competing. I think putting a plan together that helps someone transition from this very, very detailed, like down to the gram sometimes mentality with food, and times and seconds and milliseconds with performance, we need to help them get to a point where they're okay exercising, they're okay putting on a little bit more body fat because it's normal. It's normal to be higher than 4% or 8%. And arguably for reproductive health, it's essential for men and women. So I think putting that plan in place, helping them transition, prepping people for when they talk about not wanting to compete, what they can expect, because when they get to that point and they don't know what to do, there's studies with NFL athletes on this. A lot of them, when they quit working out, they develop metabolic syndrome, then they develop cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes because we don't have this transition. And I think, that's a great case study for all sports where we have competitive athletes. So I think that's the other con in the long run.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I think I hear a lot from dietitians who work with athletes is they tend to shy away from calculating calorie needs and sharing that information with their clients, teaching them how to track because of the risk of it getting to becoming obsessive in nature. And so I completely understand that. I think most of the athletes that I work with, I don't have to worry about that, but I know that I'm not working with a lot of athletes who would say be predisposed to that or at a higher risk of that. And so I can completely understand why certain practitioners would just say, hey, I'm just not even going to include this or involve this because of the potential damage that it could cause as soon as I'm not in a position where I can help this athlete.
And sometimes I hear what you're saying. I think too, the team environment or team sports rather than those individual competitions where, you're the main competitor, you're not on a team. I think that dynamic influences this because in a team setting like football, everyone has a different position, but you obviously, if you're a linebacker, you probably want to be the best. And ways that you get the best are by having more mass, being powerful, eating, and you have to eat more to do that. So I think kind of considering the dynamic too, as far as like, are you on a team? Are you competing in an individual level? What kind of category? What kind of sport? For teams, like what's your position? When do you play? Like how often do you get put in first? What are your goals within the team? Because those are all going to influence food choice. And I think, not including the calories for somebody can be good in some settings because especially in team sports, people eat more in a group usually. So when the dietitian is preparing all the food, it already checks the boxes. There's availability of foods that are great for recovery or great for performance. And you have the control of fueling your athletes and are eating in a social setting. A lot of times you don't have to worry as much about eating, which I think may be one reason some practitioners don't share that. But it can also be as simple as saying, I need you to eat 5 times a day. And when you eat, I want you to have a fist-sized amount of non-starchy vegetables. I want you to have your palm for a protein. And I want you to have this for a fat. So it can be as simple as saying your hands are your serving sizes because hands are proportional to your body. And using that and saying, eat 5 times a day and have this much using your hand in this food category each time.
Yeah, there's ways around just tracking everything.
Right. I think it comes down to the person and the sport.
Yeah. So hopefully some of that hate will be dissipated a little bit because we're discussing this now. Awesome. So I think it's time to talk about poop.
All right. It's my specialty.
So tell us.
It's a microbiome joke for people watching that don't totally get that.
So tell us, what do athletes need to know about poop?
Well, I think, there's a lot of things that start with ingestive physiology. So for example, simple sugars when you're competing are going to be naturally absorbed faster in a liquid form, faster if it's a simple sugar rather than a complex fiber. That's where things like the goo packets can come in handy. The downside of eating too much of that is when you have a lot of simple sugar, you can also have a lot of diarrhea, which no one wants when they're running or cycling. Well, really ever, but especially in the middle of a competition.
Especially then. Yeah, especially then.
Yeah, right. We also know that having a lot of diarrhea can be stress-induced, but also can be really inflammatory to the GI tract. Just like vomiting for the upper GI tract, diarrhea is going to inflame the lower GI tract. And when we have diarrhea, we acutely disrupt the bacterial flora that are present. Not a big deal if it's one time and you're eating like you normally do. That's going to switch back in a matter of days. Back to your natural GI flora. Now, if you're having diarrhea every day, that's going to change the bacteria that are present in your GI tract, which can affect how you absorb and digest the foods you're eating. And that's where it becomes important. So looking at the consistency of your bowel movements, how often you have a bowel movement, if there were certain types of training or competitions, considering all of those and then linking it to what are you eating and when are you eating it so that we can help resolve this is important. It's important just to feel optimal for performance, but also you're not going to get a good time if you're stopping every hour to run to a porta potty.
Relieve yourself.
Yes. So really important. Talking about hydration, that's important, especially for power athletes that are eating really high protein. Protein can be extremely dehydrating and result in constipation or stools that are hard to pass. And over prolonged periods of time, that can obviously cause hemorrhoids, which are awful. No one wants to deal with those. And so I think there's just a lot of different factors like that that are going to tie into the microbiome and the GI tract. So as far as what athletes should consider. Pre and probiotics are great. If this is happening a lot, some doctors will actually prescribe probiotics that we know are effective rather than trying to buy over the shelf. So you don't really know what you're getting. And in some instances, probiotics cannot actually exacerbate GI distress. So I would recommend a food first approach, eating foods that are higher fiber first, like, brown rice and apples, those types of things to kind of help firm up the stool or slow GI transit. That's important. If there's a link for the athlete between, the amount of simple sugars they're eating and diarrhea, I think reassessing when we're eating those and how much we're eating is important.
Gotcha. Yeah, I haven't really heard too much about ways to like correct or improve diarrhea, especially for endurance athletes. And I know like triathletes, they'll talk very, very openly about like, this was a bad one because like this bike ride was awful and here's why. And like, it's just, you get to a certain point in certain sports and like, okay, nothing's off limits. Everybody's dealt with it. Let's all share our experiences so that we can maybe save somebody,
Right.
A bad day. And
yes, absolutely.
Yeah, but that it makes sense just adjusting something like sugar.
Yeah, because how concentrated doses of sugar are. I mean, they can run right through you, literally, and it's not fun for anybody.
No, you don't want to be behind somebody who's having that sort of problem. That's for sure. In addition to being the person with the problem. So.
Oh yeah, not.
So, what are some really good either prebiotic or probiotic food sources?
So inulin is a great prebiotic. Inulin can be found in, especially now in yogurts. It's being added, so you'll see it in the form of chicory root. You can also buy inulin supplementation. If someone's struggling to get enough fiber, you can always take a Metamucil packet. It really depends on whether we want to stop someone up or speed something up, because soluble versus insoluble fiber have different effects on the GI tract. So that's why, the consistency, the frequency, and the foods we're eating are important to look at so that we can kind of tweak it. Inulin is one of the most well-known prebiotics, but prebiotics really actually are dietary fibers. So when we're talking about that, we're really talking about fiber, and fiber is important for the GI tract and for homeostasis of that bacteria, because fiber provides foods for the microbes that are in the GI tract. So that's how they flourish and colonize your GI tract for optimal metabolism and digestion. Probiotics are going to be live bacteria or sometimes spores that we consume through a capsule or potentially through a dairy product like kefir or Activia or something like that are going to help populate beneficial bacteria for regularity into the GI tract.
Anytime I hear Activia, I just think maybe SNL did a skit or somebody did a skit where they called it Shitivia, and I just can't not think about that. Anytime I hear it, I'm like, ha ha ha. But yeah, it's good stuff.
And everyone's different, because when I tried Activia, nothing happened, and I was like, this is a crock.
It's not for you.
But I know other people who are like, I had one yogurt and I couldn't stay out of the bathroom that day, and I'm like, really? That didn't happen for me.
Must have had a bad batch or something.
I don't know. I don't know what it is, but I was like, yeah, not so much for me.
Wow, that's hilarious. So, that's funny. So let's shift a little bit. When we had talked on the phone, you talked a little bit about hormones, and we got to talk a little bit about like the first book that I wrote, hormonal nutrition, where I cover, what I thought were the 12 most metabolically influential hormones. But I left out a lot of hormones that I was like, oh my gosh, I'll never finish this book if I try to learn anything like estrogen, way over my head. Thyroid hormone, too long. So I kept it to 12, and I was like, these are good. So tell us a little bit about how hormones play a role not only in exercise but also in body comp or just metabolism in general, and then specifically thyroid hormone, if you could.
Sure. Yeah. So we know that when body composition changes to where body fat's really low, for men, that can result in decreased testicular size, decreased fertility, and some mood swings and difficulty sleeping. For women, when we disrupt estrogen, we get amenorrhea, which is a loss of a period, or sometimes when we have too much estrogen, we can get what's known as heavy menstrual bleeding, which is a really heavy sloughing of the uterine lining and sometimes can be caused by fibroids. So it's important, if you're having symptoms associated with a disruption in reproductive hormones or sex hormones, important to see a physician. I'm certainly not an expert on that, but I do know a lot about thyroid hormone because it's really important. Endocrinology is a huge part of obesity, and it's a huge part of diabetes management. So thyroid hormone, the thyroid gland is going to use iodine from food to make two thyroid hormones, which are going to be T3 and T4. These hormones are stored and released as needed. The hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, which are located in the brain, are going to help control the thyroid gland. So the hypothalamus is going to release TRH, which is thyrotrypsin releasing hormone, and that's going to stimulate. I know, I had to think about it. It's a big one. Yes. Lots of T's in there, which stimulates the pituitary gland to release thyroid stimulating hormone. Most people have heard of this referred to as TSH. So when the hypothalamus and pituitary are working normally, they sense when thyroid hormones are low. So when thyroid hormones are low, we get an uptick in TSH, which is going to stimulate the thyroid to make more hormones. When thyroid hormones are too high, TSH is going to rapidly drop and reduce hormone production by the thyroid. So that's often why a physician will order a TSH, sometimes a T3 and T4 if they're doing a full thyroid panel. But TSH is a good indicator of what's happening in the gland and circulating levels. So when thyroid hormones are too low or too high, it can slow up or speed down the heart rate. So a lot of times, this is where it can get a little tricky. Bradycardia, which is a heart rate in the 50s, or below 60, is going to be a proxy for hypothyroidism or a low thyroid hormone when TSH is really high. Now, that can be challenging if we have someone who's fit, because we know that heart rate with fitness decreases, right? Mm-hmm. So, and then when thyroid hormone is high, we have low TSH and a high heart rate or tachycardia. So that's how it impacts heart rate, but it can also raise or lower body temperature. It can influence how fast foods move through the GI tract. So a lot of times with hypothyroidism, constipation is really common, which can make it difficult when we're just thinking about diet. Mm-hmm. It can also control the way muscles contract and also fatigue. So, and then most importantly, it regulates metabolism. So it's going to regulate the rate at which calories are burned, and it can affect weight loss and weight gain. So when our thyroid hormone is low, weight loss is really difficult, and a lot of times we see weight gain. Whereas when when hyperthyroidism occurs or TSH is really low, we see the opposite. So people are usually really thin, they're really cold, they're always eating, they can't gain weight, and those are common characteristics. So really important when we're talking about performance, because a lot of those are are also indicators of fitness or
Mm.
lack of fitness. So when someone's reporting lots of symptoms, especially if someone's reporting hair loss, really important to think thyroid and send them to their primary care physician to request a panel.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's one of the arguments that these people who don't think calories exist, this is an argument that they give instead of like, okay, well, instead of this being viewed as kind of like more the exception to the rule, they're like, no, this exception negates the whole rule. Obviously, because if you look at people with thyroid issues and thyroid hormone problems, calories don't work. It's like, okay, all right, pump the brakes.
Is true if it's not managed.
Mm-hmm.
If someone has hypothyroidism, which is the most common thyroid issue in the United States, aside from like benign thyroid nodules, which are also a symptom of hypothyroidism, medically that's managed usually through something called levothyroxine or Synthroid. Those are the medications to help regulate the thyroid stimulating hormone. And when that happens, usually we see attendant weight loss. We see an increase in alertness, decline in fatigue. We see a normalization of heart rate. So calories still matter when thyroid hormone is managed. Managing thyroid hormone is also a meticulous process because you have to go in annually for labs, and refills are scripted. I think 3 months is the most you can get, which is pretty standard with a medication like that. But sometimes when thyroid levels are off, they'll do what's called a thyroid study, or a series where you come in every 6 weeks, sometimes more closely together, for repeat labs to see what's happening when the dose is adjusted so that they can get the right dose and that person can feel better.
Gotcha. So all that to say, when it's being treated correctly,
yes,
you
calories matter.
You can't just throw out these laws of thermodynamics.
Right. I will say, though, it's not uncommon, especially for women. A lot of times hypothyroidism can occur around the age of menopause. So it's hard sometimes because women will write this off to going through the change when it's like, well, actually, yeah, maybe that's some of it, but a lot of the reason you're only eating salads and you can't lose weight is because your thyroid you have hypothyroidism. And when that's fixed, we see a huge drop. And I know this from experience because this is a huge problem with all the women in my family. So I've heard all the symptoms. I've given the nutrition consults and seen the labs. And my mentor in my postdoc is also an endocrinologist. So something that I think is really interesting because it affects body weight.
Wow. Yeah, that's really interesting. And yeah, we covered about 50 different topics today.
A lot.
We rolled through it. And by we, I mean you.
Well, hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully answered all your questions and didn't create too many waves in the water.
Oh well if it did. Can't make everybody happy. So no, I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
Me too. Thanks for having me.
For sure. Before we close out, how can people follow you? How can they reach out to you for questions or yeah? How can we read some of your research?
Well, I'm on ResearchGate. So to find me on ResearchGate, you just type Cassie M as in Monday, Mitchell in, and I'll come up. All my publications are linked there. To contact me with questions about nutrition, questions about my research, speaking engagements, my academic history or current research, you can go to my website, which is CassieMMitchell.com. And you'll see all my services and my background on there and other talks I've given.
Awesome. Well, I will include that in the show notes. So
Thanks.
For sure. So people can look you up. So yeah, I mean, I don't know about the people listening and watching, but like I think it's flown by. We're already like an hour 24.
That's a
We're
lot.
rolling. Yeah, that's great.
I
That's
think
awesome
I too.
conversation.
Yes,
Yeah,
I agree. I had fun.
awesome. So thank you so much for taking the time to do this. It's been excellent. I can't wait to get you on again in the future to discuss more fun stuff.
Perfect.
And yeah, awesome. Thank you again. And yeah, go ask Cassie questions, y'all. Don't wait.
Oh, and if you're interested in what it's like owning rescues, horses, cats, dogs, you can follow me on Instagram, which is at Adventures with Tansy.
Perfect. I'll throw that in as well.
Or hiking
Awesome.
trails. I can always recommend those.
Excellent. Well,
Awesome.
Is that like just in Arizona or is that like elsewhere?
No, I've backpacked all over. I've backpacked in the UK. I climbed the 2 highest mountains there. I've backpacked in Colorado, West Virginia, some in the Smoky Mountains, Arizona, and California. So all over, and Utah. So all
Perfect.
over. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I'm traveling to Colorado and Utah next month, so I'm going to ask you about that.
Yeah, feel free.
Awesome. Alrighty, y'all. Thanks for watching and listening. Stay tuned for next week's episode. Adios.
Bye.